Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 170. What should you consider for picking a font for coding in Python? What characters and their respective glyphs should you check before making your decision? This week on the show, we talk with Real Python author and core team member Philipp Acsany about his recent article, Choosing the Best Coding Font for Programming. Philipp shares some of his background as a font engineer and graphic designer. We talk about how font design tools were his introduction to programming in Python. We discuss how frequent Python syntax of underscores, @signs, parentheses, and asterisks should affect your decision. Philipp's tutorial provides several resources to help you find a Monospace font that fits your coding requirements. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Philipp, welcome to the show.
Hello. I'm super happy to be back.
Yeah, we had you on, maybe a year ago. You came on with Christopher and myself, and we talked about your Flask sort of series, I guess it was.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember it like it was yesterday. No, it was it was November last year when I was creating the series about Flask. And I had the honor of joining the two Christophers on the show.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah, well, and you're back to discuss something that is maybe a little closer to your history in programming and previous career path, to talk about fonts. And you wrote this article titled Choosing the Best Coding Font for Programming. It came out about a month or so ago. And I have to admit that I sort of glossed over it because I was like, oh, I got my font selected, I'm good. But then you actually went on another podcast to talk about it, Engineering Kiosk number 79, which is a German podcast. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about that show. Had you been listening to it, or how'd those guys find you?
Well, to be honest, I would love to say that I was a long-time listener and was invited to the show finally, but this only holds true to the Real Python podcast, not the other one.
Okay.
But they stumbled over my tutorial, which was super cool, and they were happy that it was a German speaker writing it, and so they invited me to their tech podcast, and we were talking a little bit about it, about programming fonts and all of this. Yeah, so then you came along, be like, hey, it can't just be a German podcast talking about fonts. You need to come to this show as well.
Hey. No, actually, when I dug into the article, I got kind of fascinated due to the sort of digging into different areas, and we'll talk about it. Partly just there's a lot of really interesting, kind of fascinating angles beyond what I might call the fussiness of setting up things. I used to listen pretty regularly to like a productivity podcast. It was called Back to Work. The host is this guy, Merlin Mann. He's kind of famous like for different things, but one of the things he coined the phrase inbox zero that a lot of people use for kind of managing your email and stuff like that. But anyway, he likes to use this term of productivity porn. This idea that you spend all this time and effort of like getting things perfectly right, and it's going to really make you so much more productive. If I just got some better pens, a new quality notebook, man, I'm really going to get stuff done. And so I feel like I lived that for a little bit. And I also have a different relationship with fonts. I was in a band. A lot of people know that I'm kind of a music guy. And I spent, countless days at Kinko's making copies. If people are familiar with that place of making copies and things like that. So I was selecting fonts and making jackets for cassette tapes that we were selling, or CDs or flyers. So fonts were a big part of my life back, actually one of the biggest revolutions that computers provided individuals was, hey, you could print stuff at home. And so in the 90s, that was like a huge thing. So yeah, I have kind of a mixed background on fonts. So then as I dug into this, I was like, oh, wait, I haven't really thought about it in a programming sense outside of, the general idea, like when you pick a font for programming, most people kind of steer toward, or actually most environments steer toward a monospace font. And maybe you could describe that in case somebody's not familiar with it. And so what's a monospace font?
Yeah, so maybe let me start off with that. I totally know what you're saying about like this, that you can dive into creating your perfect programming environment and choosing a color theme and stuff like this.
Sure.
And I think it's good to do it because I mean you want to be in a room that's well decorated where you're happy to work, and I think the computer should be one of those places. But I totally see it that you can overdo it, and it can be kind of like an excuse to not doing the actual work.
But it looks really pretty right now.
And here I come along and be like, let me add one tool to your tool set where you need to choose the best thing for, and this is fonts. And I wanted to create this tutorial because fonts are close to my heart, and we can talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But I didn't just want to create a tutorial like there are so many of them, like the 10 best fonts that you can use for programming, but I wanted to give it a different take and dive a little bit deeper, and also explain a little bit why it might make sense to look a little bit closer, and why it might make sense to actually change the font that you're having in the editor. And you were mentioning Monospace. That's kind of the general thing. Usually it's Monospace fonts, but that's also where it stops. And Monospace means every character has the same space, and not, for example, like in a proportional font where an I, which is a very narrow character, only gets the space it needs.
Right.
In the Monospace font, it has the same space like a uppercase W.
Right.
Which then in the end results in sometimes weird designs because you need to do something with the space that the character now has. And and if you dive in there, you can see that different fonts choose different font designers or type designers choose different ways of solving this problem. And that's where you can go into the rabbit hole and really find out where programming fonts perform or not perform for your own taste.
Yeah, so maybe we could talk about the article itself, the tutorial. I really like that you included a healthy family of fonts. I forget the exact number, but it comes with a PDF that you can sort of show on your computer screen to have two windows together as you're diving into the details of the fonts, the ligatures or the spacing or, the different designs that are in there. You can kind of compare this list of fonts over. That was a neat idea. How'd you come up with why that was going to work for you?
So one thing which was important to me is to not favor one font. So that basically all boils down to choose this font because this one is the best, because it's a super personal choice, and
right.
You can buy it here. So like maybe like as a footnote, all of these fonts I'm talking about in the tutorial are free to use. So there weren't any affiliate links or something like that. And it's a personal taste. And what I try to do is to kind of give you, the reader, a big bunch of fonts that you have enough to look at, and you can make comparisons, maybe be a bit overwhelmed at the beginning, but then I try to take you along by like just spotlighting one font at a time with a different feature. And in the end, I think it's 27 fonts that I chose. Some of them are more known, like Roboto or Roboto, like Roboto or Anonymous Pro, or
is that the Italian version there?
Roboto, and JetBrains Mono. So some of them are more well known, and often are the more obvious choices. And then I took some that were not so well known. And I don't know, I think when I started writing the article, I had around 10 fonts that I was looking at. But while I was writing, I found so many other interesting fonts that I wanted to discuss in the article. So the list grew and grew and grew.
Yeah.
And it's the nice thing is, in the end, it's a little bit like you're walking through a gallery, and you look at this painting and you like this because of whatever reasons, and the other painting you don't like. And at the end of your walk through the gallery, you might walk out with three. Well, hopefully you don't walk out with the paintings, but you walk out with the postcards that you can buy in the souvenir shop in the end, where you that you really like.
Yeah, exit through the gift shop.
Exactly. So I try to do the same. That you read the tutorial and you have this list that you can have as a PDF. You go out and then, like, after reading the tutorial, you go out and try those fonts out in your own programming editor.
Yeah. I like that they're all downloadable. You can include the links for them, include this resource of the PDF to do the comparisons with, not only the font itself, but the number of styles that it comes in, and then some other kind of key elements there. And so nice resources to kind of include. And then I guess one of the things that we can kind of dive into and why this becomes kind of crucial is there are potential issues that you might come up into when you start programming with a font. And a lot of it has to do with, I feel like, readability. And a lot of existing fonts, they end up not being focused on that. It's more of like for scannability in a certain way. Whereas in programming, it's really important that you can tell the difference between a number 1 and a lowercase l or the letter I, capitalized or what have you. And we can kind of get into some of the details there, but you do a lot of that kind of stuff where you're like, okay, well, if you compare here, you're going to start to see some of these differences. And I think you might have, a good 10 or 12 different sort of factors that you've included in there, and say, hey, actually drill in and look at this. And that actually became very interesting.
Yeah.
Does that kind of get into some of your background too? Or
yeah. So maybe like just to take one step back and talk about fonts in general, which
yeah, sure.
Which I find so interesting, is that the moment we wake up in the morning, pick our phone, or we look around, we read a book, read the newspapers, we go out, and there are typefaces everywhere. So you can't walk through the world without
signage. Yeah,
exactly, without seeing words and letters. And there are people who design this. And as a programmer, you're staring at your code for such a long time. And maybe especially as a Python programmer, there is this beautiful code and white space notion that the programming language brings. And the font is front and center of this. So it's worth to take a closer look at it and to investigate what makes my font that I'm using more readable, or what features do I like or dislike, and to then make a choice that ideally the code that you're writing is not just beautiful because of the content that you're writing, but also the font that you're using.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I agree. And it's not something that I dug too deep into. Like, I feel that overall, it's something I spent maybe a short amount of time in configuring my editor and then looking at a couple things. And then maybe every once in a while, something new comes along. Like you had mentioned JetBrains Mono, which is one of the ones that's in the list here.
Yeah.
And when that came along, I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And that's actually one that I've tried out recently and have been recent, being last 2 years, has been a change in some of the stuff that I've tried out. So yeah, there's a lot of factors that go into there. What were some of the things that you felt that you could drill into as far as this comparison and these areas to kind of focus on, to say, hey, let me take you on this guided tour of fonts and design and what's happening there?
Yes. So basically there are two bigger areas, and one area is maybe true for not only programming fonts, but fonts in general. And when I was learning, so my background, to quickly weave this in, so I learned type design. So I wanted to be a illustrator, then I wanted to be a graphics designer, and at art school you did different things. And there was also type design as one profession that you could choose. And I got curious because the cool thing about type design, so when you're actually designing those letters that you're seeing everywhere, is that it's black and white. So you don't have to bother about cleaning your brushes or color theory and stuff like this, but you're only working with forms, the negative space of things. And this was very appealing to me, to kind of get rid of everything that brought color into it.
Yeah, it's very stark in some ways. Yeah,
exactly. That brought color on my table, and I was able to to work mainly digital, which I also liked. And when you're starting to design, your first typeface, there is one important rule, and that is that a letter, like a specific letter, is understood as a specific letter. So if you think about a lowercase a, you have kind of like a form in your head, and then you have different typefaces that interpret this form in a certain way. So they have different ways of how this little a looks, but it still needs to be understood as an A. So you can't go too crazy. And I mean,
right.
I was in art school, so people wanted to go crazy. And that was the thing that the professors always needed to make sure that you can't just draw anything and pretend it's an A. People need to read it.
Right.
And the other thing is then, even if you design the most beautiful A in the world, it also has to work with the other characters. And a font can have so many characters. Looking at from a programmer perspective, you don't only have ASCII, but you also have different languages. Like you have Greek, you have Cyrillic, you have Korean, and so on. So it's basically it's a never-ending repertoire of characters that you could design, and they need to work together. So coming back to
right.
the little
they
A.
They need to look like they're part of the family or whatever you call it.
Exactly. So coming back to the little A. So if you have a word like able, so the A and the B and the L and the E need to work together. So they have to speak the same language. They have to look similar. And so in the end, it's kind of like you design an individual letter, but in the end, you have to make the whole system work. And that's something which later was very similar when I learned programming, that it's kind of a similar approach, that you can't just write this one beautiful algorithm if the rest of your program sucks. So you need to find a balance between right. Between everything there. And coming back to the programming fonts, that's something which I wanted to look at, like how are the letters designed and do they properly represent what they stand for, and how good can I differentiate them from others. And that's basically where the bridge is built to the second field, is like what makes a programming font different than a normal font, besides maybe of being monospace and being a bit more technical in the characteristics.
Right.
Is that for us programmers, it's super important to understand, like, this is a 1 and this is an L and this is an uppercase I, because if they look too similar, you don't know what code you're writing here and there.
Right. Or you're going to interpret other people's code the wrong way, potentially. And if you're trying to look at something, you're going to potentially retype a variable name incorrectly. There's all kinds of weird little errors you could make. I guess a similar one would be one, there's actually, I don't know if it's a rule or not, but pretty common thing with programming fonts or maybe monospace fonts is the confusion that can happen with a 0 and an uppercase letter O.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple different techniques they use there, right?
Exactly. So that's a very common thing. That's, for example, there's a little dot inside of the 0, or there is a slash in the 0. So you really make sure that this is not an uppercase O, but a 0. And that's a very common thing. And luckily, and that's a nice thing, many of those fonts provide different styles of a 0. And when you download, sometimes you can configure your own font that you're saying, like, hey, I like the dotted 0 more than the slashed one, so please put the dotted 0 as the standard 0 into my font. Or you can use Python tools to put them into the font. And so it's nice to see that the type designers who make the fonts are aware of the different tastes that their users have.
I haven't seen the dotted 0 as much. That seems to be a little less common one. The /0 was something I'd seen pretty commonly, coming into fonts in the 90s and so forth. But yeah, I don't know if that's like a different parts of the world kind of preference or just a recent thing. It seemed like kind of a change to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know about that. If there was a shift to the dotted 0 or the /0 at some point, it maybe also has to do with better screens now. So if you're working with small text in a small resolution, maybe the slash inside of a 0 is more distinctive than just having the dot. So maybe it is
Yeah.
not
Okay.
so well readable. But yeah, I don't know. Like I'm looking at the list of fonts right now, and I think it's 50-50 what zero they are having as their standard zero. But yeah, and
Interesting.
then you have other
Yeah.
characters, like I was mentioning the uppercase I and the L, where it's not this quote unquote simple way of solving this issue by putting a slash through it. So, for example, if your name is L and you're using some font to write AL, it also can look like AI, and I think that is
Yeah.
something which
Al Swigert has definitely talked about that, and he's complained about it. He's like, I hate that my name in a lot of fonts just looks like AI, and it's like, so he's tended to want to maybe just capitalize the whole thing, because then the L will definitely stand out. But yeah,
exactly, and I mean, in a programming font, this is something which is a common issue that you want to because you don't have the typical words often. So you have sometimes weird character combinations. So you really want to make sure that your uppercase I is understood as an uppercase I. And so there comes something into play which is called serifs. These are the little like legs and arms that characters can have to really make it clear, like this is an uppercase I and this is a lowercase L, this is a 1, and so on.
yeah, you'll see it on like a lowercase L, where there'll be like a little top piece and maybe like a tiny hook at the bottom of it to kind of really differentiate it in certain fonts. Yeah, I kind of wonder about like monospace fonts, if the term is somewhat related to typewriters, like in the sense that those would be standardized spacing also, right?
Yeah, and if you look at some monospace fonts, they share the aesthetic of typewriter fonts, and some of I can't put the finger on which ones they are, but probably some of the fonts that I was discussing in the article were descendants from some typewriter, and they're basically every letter needed to have their own space, and probably, and that's an area where I'm also not so knowledgeable about, terminals came into play, and you had like your screen metrics. So probably it was also super important that all the letters have the same space. And now it goes more into a direction where you could argue it's still an aesthetic that we as programmers may like, and it still has some advantages. So, for example, if you're moving your cursor up and down, you don't want to like let it like jump through some kind of weird grid, but you want like the horizontals and the verticals aligned, and it gives a more clear text body in your code if it's monospace. But it doesn't really have to be monospace in an editor, at least in a normal text editor. At least I think in terminal it still makes sense, especially if you're creating graphical user or text interfaces in the terminal, where you need to have borders and stuff like this. So you want to have everything aligned next to each other. But in the editor, it's still mainly monospace, because it's kind of like the aesthetic that we came into, and it still makes sense to use a monospace font as a programmer.
Right. Like you were talking about the alignment, that you can tell alignment wise that these lines of code are the same length, and it allows you to do certain things with the white space aesthetic of Python, of like indentation and
exactly
and so forth. It's like, okay, these characters kind of, it's an interesting art form in and of itself that is kind of goes unnoticed if you aren't paying any attention to it.
Exactly. And I mean, maybe just to mention it, when I was researching this tutorial, for me, it was basically a given that a font has to be monospace as a programming font. And again, like for the terminal, this still holds true, but not so much for the editor. And I stumbled upon a blog entry where the creator of Input Mono was saying, well, actually, you can also use my Input Sans font as a programming font. And he says that it looks, in his opinion, even a bit better than his Mono font, because coming back to this monospace, you can give each character the space it needs, and the lowercase I, for example, doesn't need so much space. So your code will actually look a little bit neater if you're using this Input Sans font. And well, at first I was like, I don't believe you. Then I downloaded it, and it was true. So I used it for a while, and apart from some issues here and there, it worked quite well. But yeah, to keep things a bit simpler, I think it's still a good idea to look for Monospace fonts, and all the fonts that we have in the tutorial are basically Monospace fonts.
Some of the areas that you spend some time on is you drill into what I would call potentially problematic areas. And I had asked you offline right before we started that these sort of collections of letters, it's similar to like the phrases somebody might type out to see and compare a font before the brown dog jumps over, whatever, that kind of thing. I think there's a couple of those phrases, but you had done this to kind of do this comparison. And so you said, okay, well, look at how lowercase the letter A, G, J, K, and Y kind of look, and then compare them across the different fonts. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then you kind of like, I think you did about 7 or 8 or different areas kind of drilling into these. And I found those really useful, but you said there really wasn't a specific name for this sort of comparison subset of letters.
Yeah, like I wish there was, or maybe I should come up with one. Like this is the official way of comparing programming fonts now. So for me, it was more about which characters are interesting to look at. And coming back to when you're designing a font, there are, or I should say, like a typeface, because the font is basically like the software, the font file, and the typeface is more like the idea of the design and stuff like this. And the font is the technical representation that you can install on your computer.
Okay.
But to keep things simple, let's say font. So when you're designing a font, there are letters that are, or characters that are more fun to design, and others that are a bit more dull.
Okay.
And for example, the lowercase a is a really interesting one because you have different decisions to make. So there is a double story A and like a single story A, which is hard to describe in audio now. But so basically one just has like one bow and the other one has like this little arm above it.
Yeah, reaching above it.
Exactly. And the same is with a G. Sometimes you have like those two bubbles basically sitting on top of each other, and sometimes you also just have like this tail on the bottom. And when you're designing something like this, you're basically defining the language that the design language that the font will speak. So if you look at those letters, you can get a really good impression about the characteristics of a font. This is something which always...
What kind of tails it's going to have.
Exactly.
If it's going to have bubbles, and...
How playful is it? How like strict is it? And
playful, yeah.
And this
funky.
is something that fascinated me. Yeah, from the beginning when I started to learn more about graphics design, is of course when you set a text, you have the text content that transmits some kind of meaning, but the font that you're setting this text in does as well. And as a very cliche example, think about Comic Sans and maybe like a lawyer letter that you're getting from a lawyer suing you about something, and it's set in Comic Sans. So it's there is some kind of like this weird friction there. So there is always some emotional baggage that a font brings with, which can be positive or negative. So if you look at those letters in a programming font, you can have this on a certain level in a more specific area as well. That you're looking at a font. For example, there is one. It's a Fantasque Sans Mono, which is very playful, and I can totally see programmers cheering for a font like this and saying like, yeah, I want to have like a font that brings a little bit of spice into my editor. And others are like, wow, that's not technical enough. Like I don't like those wiggly lines here and there. So yeah, and that's why I thought, like, for example, A, G, J, K, and Y are interesting characters to look at, or the uppercase Q, where you have like this little tail coming out of the Q, which designers also have to find a solution how to do it. And some are more playful, some are more straight.
Right.
And looking at them, you can really see the character of a programming font just looking at those letters.
Yeah, it makes me think of my one of my favorite Saturday Night Live things of the Avatar. with Ryan Gosling.
Papyrus.
I'm sure you've seen that. Yeah, Papyrus. Yeah, so I'll include a link to that if you haven't seen it. It's hilarious. So on the font discussion. I like the other combinations you did, though. Like, that's why I thought to myself, like, are these the regular ones? Like, you did a way of sort of comparing uppercase letters and numbers, and you used capital H, 7, capital C, 9, and T. And they have a very interesting flow together also, and can really point out the numbers sometimes are interesting. Like, I want to call them like subset, but they can be sort of offset in an interesting way.
Yeah.
Which that tells you a lot and can, I think, lead to very interesting readability, especially if you're going to combine them, numbers and letters in different ways in your programming.
Absolutely, and that's something which might be again a difference to a normal text font, where certain combinations, if we talk about letters and numbers, you probably don't have that many occurrences where they appear together. But in programming, that's like not super uncommon. So it's good
right.
to have a closer look at it as well. And for example, with the H, like the uppercase H is a good character to look at, because it kind of defines the capital height of the capital letters.
Yeah.
And I decided to put the 7 next to it, because the 7 also has this top bar. And there you can see in some fonts, they have the same height. So it gives a very smooth line if you have the letters H7 next to each other. And in other fonts, they don't have the same height. So you have a little bit of a bumpy ceiling.
Right.
And again, no judging. Some people might like it more to have like this little bumpiness, because it makes it also more differentiating. So it's maybe a bit easier to differentiate the number from an uppercase letter. But for others, that might look silly. So again, everybody can choose what they like. And then you mentioned like the C and the 9. So there you have this roundedness on the top that you can compare with each other. So that's why it's H7 and C9. And I wrap it up with the T, because the T again has this top bar to see like how low does the 9 stands compared to the T. That's why I came with this weird string of letters, which from now on is the official way of comparing numbers and letters in programming fonts.
You have to use this.
Yeah. No way around it.
This is the Philippism. So the other differentiation I felt like works really well is this set that you have that I think really dives into the programming language part of it, which is, and I've had this problem, I think other people probably have had this problem of differentiating a comma and a period. And then that leads right into colon or semicolon. And then you had this whole like set that went there from there. I won't dive into it, but when you're thinking about a programming font, like comma and period, and knowing the difference between the two makes a huge difference when you're programming, as far as like how it's going to behave. So, and forgetting one is going to be a mess. So
that is so true. And that was also a little bit when I was getting annoyed at some design solutions that some of those fonts had. And I mean, granted, some of them might not have started as programming fonts.
Yeah.
But the more I looked at some of those details, and you were mentioning the comma and the dot, it's so important that you can see the difference. And in some fonts, you have like this, the comma is kind of like a little bit longer than a dot. And in small sizes, it's really hard to differentiate. And so that is something which I think as a programmer really makes sense to have a closer look. Depending on the font size you're using the font with, obviously, and how well your eyesight is. But it really makes sense to to choose a font where you can differentiate it, because it's, I mean, on the keyboard, they are next to each other as well. So it's really easy to have a typo here using the wrong one. And if you're working with numbers or currency or stuff like this, you don't want to like put the comma or the dot in the wrong spot. So it makes sense to have a font where you can really differentiate them. And again, looking at the design, how some type designers chose to solve this problem, you can really find really nice ways how they did it. For example, in the Mononoke, the comma is really excessive. And if you're just looking at it as it is, it looks weird, but it makes so much sense as a programming font that you can really see like, okay, so this is a comma compared to the dot, which is like a circle-ish thing. And this was the moment
it's pretty
where
accentuated. Yeah,
exactly. So this were the moments where I was kind of getting more and more excited to see that like the thoughts that designers put into the design of fonts. And because coming back to my time when I was designing typefaces, at some point I kind of like pivoted into learning to program, because when you're creating fonts, there is a big cosmos of tools around it, which is usually created in Python. So that's how I became a programmer, and I kind of waved goodbye to
that's interesting.
to the type designers who continue to designing fonts. And it's such a tedious process because you have so many characters and there are so many things you need to keep in mind. And in the end, and maybe that's like, I kind of like this notion of nobody really thinks about it unless it doesn't work. So if you're creating a nice typeface and it just works, nobody really might think about it unless they're reading a tutorial about programming fonts or they are graphic designers. But to see like that there is always a decision in the background made. And when I was looking at those commas, it was nice to think about the designer probably like being on their computer for days, like just like mingling with the Bezier curves to get like this perfect comma there. And in the end, I don't know if they got feedback from like other users who say like, "Mwah, really nice comma." So
right.
That's why I was very, very excited that I looked a bit closer and to see that's really the love that many of those put into their fonts.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It's following the theme of working with characters and words this week. You get to design a command line interface-based game that you can share with friends, and it looks great too. It's titled Create a Python Wordle Clone with Rich. Based on a Real Python step-by-step project by Gerarna Hjella, the video course is presented by Darren Jones, and he'll show you how to build out a command line application from a prototype to a polished game, read and validate user input, use Rich's console to create an attractive user interface in the terminal, refactor your code as you go and practice adding tests, organize your code into functions, and provide your users with actionable feedback. I think this project is a worthy investment of your time to learn CLI fundamentals, practice refactoring, and get a project that's fun to share with others. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. In this case, a version of the project after each section of the course. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the search tool on realpython.com. To drill into using Python in the creation of these fonts, is it something where it's helping you fill out the family based upon a certain set of techniques, or how is Python being used in that industry, and how you kind of ended up falling in love with it and making that more of your direction for the rest of your career?
So yeah, there is this moment of automation, which Python is basically a great way of being lazy and letting Python do things for you. And again, if you're thinking about the characters that a font has, there is an A. And then in German, you have the A umlaut with the two dots above. And then you have like different other diacritics above it. So basically, you kind of have the system and you have to exercise it through a whole bunch of other characters. So that's something where automation really helps you, because you don't want to set them by hand. There is software that you're usually used to design fonts. So back in the days, there was FontLab, when I was studying. Nowadays, there is something called RoboFont, which is entirely written in Python as well, that help you with stuff like this. But of course, you can, and all of them had an API to enable you to use your own scripts, which are Python scripts. So that's where it was basically, okay, so if I want to automate things like a bit more out of the box, what those editors offer to me, I guess I have to create my own tools for it. And that's something which is very common in the font engineering world. That's, type designers and font engineers who are taking more care of the technical part of fonts. They create their own tools and they create their own cosmos, because it's not a really big industry like that there would be an Adobe tool or something like this for it, but it's this tiny little world where people create their own tools, and it grew that it's most of them are built in Python. So that's how I kind of went into it. So there is one of the Python as a practical tool of automating things, but also that the font engineering world already kind of demanded Python as their chosen language for those tools.
It's interesting that they selected that as the language. What are reasons that you felt like that happened?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I think also played a role probably is that the brother from Guido van Rossum is a type designer as well, Just van Rossum.
Okay.
He's teaching in Den Haag, or I think he's still teaching in Den Haag, which is an art school which teaches type design. And he was one of the people on the forefront of creating those tools. And maybe Python was one of the more obvious choices if you have a person who can help you a phone call away. So that's maybe something which which played part in it. But I mean, the other thing which I can freely say on a Python podcast, it's a really nice programming language for people who are starting to learn programming, because the overhead to begin with is not so big, and the hurdle to start with it is not that high. You don't have the compiler and stuff like this. You don't have to install that many things. The font editors again brought like this API with them that you could basically start to program in the editor. So I think this made it easy for students to start with Python more and more. And then at some point it's kind of this locked in system basically. If everything is in Python, why would you choose to do to use a different language to do something if it's just very complicated to do so? There are a few tools which are not programmed in Python, but I think if you want to go more into this font world, Python is still the number one language to learn for this.
Yeah. So I have kind of two questions that I wanted to dive into that are talking a little bit more about languages. One is the programming language, and does it make sense to use a different font for a different programming language? Is there like a reasoning that it might make sense one way or the other? And I guess that might be what symbols are used more in one language versus another. And then the other has to do with, like, you have this whole thing on your PDF that dives into the number of characters that are available. And it's shocking the variation that is there, which I think you mentioned briefly. Like, it's like, okay, well, you're going to possibly represent all these other languages that are in a written form. And so that you might be upwards of 10,000 characters versus maybe somewhere around 800 or something like that. If you're just going beyond the standard set of ASCII. So that's kind of two separate things. So does it make sense to use a different font for a different programming language would be my first one. And then we could talk about like why it might be useful to have all these other characters for if you're programming and maybe writing comments and stuff in your own language. And is that a good idea too? So I don't know which one you want to take first.
No, let's take the programming languages first, because I think it's a bit of a smaller field in that way.
Yeah.
That many programming languages share similar syntax. So you have some characters reappearing in almost every programming language. So one of these are parentheses, quotes, curly braces, things like that. However, in some programming languages, you have them more, and in some programming languages, you have them less. And then obviously it also Depends a little bit in which field you are, so with what kind of data you're working and stuff like that. When I was starting the tutorial, I kind of was thinking like, how can I spin this to make it valid on a Python tutorial website, right? So if like I don't just want to talk about programming fonts in general, but also make it more valuable for Python programmers. While I was starting to write and research, an interesting thing happened, which I always like when writing things. It's that something occurs to me which wasn't that obvious before, and that, for example, the underscore is actually a super important character in Python programming.
Yeah.
And again, maybe for other languages as well. But I basically put the underscore as one of the most important characters to look at in Python because you're using it so often. So variables are recommended to be written in snake case. That means you have lowercase letters, then underscore to kind of make variables and variable word combinations out of it.
Yeah.
Or with methods and merging methods where you have two underscores with each other. And so that's why I thought like, okay, for Python, it's actually good to look at this character, how it's designed, because again, you have different choices to make as a designer. So one is, how thick is the line? Like, do you have like a very hairliney design, or do you have a very like bold design of this horizontal bar? Where is this bar positioned on the vertical axis? Like, is it very below the baseline? The baseline is basically the line where the letters stand or sit or lay on.
Sure.
And is this underscore like a little bit deeper or higher? And the other thing, which for me personally is quite important, does this underscore expand through the whole bounding box, which is basically the box, the horizontal space that a character can use. And often the underscore uses this entire space. That means if you have two underscores next to each other, they create a line. So there is no gap in between. And I kind of like this gap because it makes me understand, hey, there are two underscores there. There is not like one big line, which might be two underscores, might be three underscores. With this gap, it's easy to or better to see.
Right.
So that was something which when I was writing, I was a bit happy to dive into it because I never thought about this that much. But then looking at different fonts having a different approach to it. So, for example, there is a Deja Vu Sans Mono, which has a very hairline line without gaps, compared to Fira Code, for example, which is more thicker with a gap in between. Yeah, again, everybody can choose their own taste in this. So some might like this more hairline, some might like the more thick lines and so on. So this was a character which I thought was very interesting for Python programming and specifically. Yeah, and then what I was mentioning, parentheses, curly braces, the @ symbol that you're using for decorators. Depending on the code that you're writing, they might appear more or less, but you might have a preference here and there where it can make sense to use a font where they are maybe very extravaganza and like especially with the curly braces, you have the feeling that this is a character where type designers opened their window and were going wild,
had a little fun.
And some are like more straight with it. You have a character like the asterisk, which is also a very interesting character in Python programming that has different jobs to do in the Python syntax. And this little star. And if you're drawing a star, how many arms do you give the star? Is it 5? Is it 6? Is it 7 or even more? And again, different fonts have different asterisks in there. They are also bigger, smaller, sitting higher, lower.
Yeah.
And so this was very, very cool to look at and put pictures in there and call some fonts out like, hey, look, this font actually has like a super big asterisk. So the Space Mono, which maybe is a fitting name then.
It's like the size of an A sitting right next to something else. It's kind of an interesting design. Yeah.
And I know I repeat myself when I'm saying this, but again, there is no right or wrong in this. So as a programmer, you might really like this, or you say like, hey, that's too much for me.
Yeah. And then I guess that kind of leads into this idea of if you speak a different language and you're writing comments, the code is going to be in Python, which is its own, specific language, which is really kind of leans toward English in most cases. You, as somebody who speaks German natively, did you go through a phase when you were learning it and adding comments to your code that you would type those in your native language? I don't have that experience, so I kind of always wonder, what that's like. I can understand there might be circumstances where you share your code that might be different, but as you're learning, you may be experience it and doing it in a different way. So what's your experience with that as far as writing in your own native language? Would you do comments like that?
Yeah, when I started, definitely, because learning programming is so hard, and if it's not your native, if English is not your native language, you basically have to learn two languages at the same time sometimes. And now that I'm also here and there with my video courses on Real Python, I have to talk about things, which basically puts like a third level to it, where I sometimes know, like, okay, I'm using words in my written tutorials that I don't actually know how to pronounce properly.
I've seen it written so many times, but I haven't had to pronounce it. Yeah.
Exactly. So, when I was starting, there were comments all over the place, and they were in German, because I just, and there are people, or there are different paradigms out there saying, like, you should write as not many comments and as few comments as possible, and also they should be in English, because then if you share your code, it's other people can probably read it, and that's true. But I think if you're learning, just do what you want and what helps you the most. And for me, that was putting a comment on every other line, and it was in German. And in German, compared to English, you have those weird characters, like you have those umlaut that I was mentioning, the ä, the ü. So you have different letters in German.
Yeah, I can think of the ones in French, because I studied French.
And there are languages, and that's a very like Western European look at things. Like if you have other script systems like Hebrew or Greek and Cyrillic and so on, like things gets even more complicated there.
Yeah,
because the characters look completely different. That basically brings us to this other area that you were mentioning, that the font that you're using ideally should support your spoken or written language if you write comments in your in a other language than English, because English comes along, like with ASCII, you basically are in a good state. But everybody who has a Polish name knows about this, that on some websites, if you have like a slashed character or something, there is this fallback font, like rendering this one character in a different font, because the font that is used otherwise doesn't support this character.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens in your code editor as well. So there is also this fallback mechanic. If a font doesn't support a certain character, there is a fallback character used. And it's usually not a big deal. So I think it's a bigger deal if you're designing things for print or something, and there is a different font for certain letters. So, for example, if you're having a book cover and the author has a Polish name, for example, you don't want to have this weird looking font there, but you want to use a font that supports Polish as well. And in programming, you might have like a little fallback character here and there. But still, I think it's nice, and it also it shows you that the type designer cared. And of course, you can't design for every written language, but there are maybe fonts out there that supports your written language more, and therefore might be nicer for you to use, because maybe type designer comes from a similar cultural area or has some connection to a certain script system, and it's nice to see this in the programming font as well. So this might be something to consider there as well.
Yeah. So, and what's nice again, that PDF has a really good description of not only the font names and the sample printouts of it, and then you have those other kind of things that you highlighted. Does it have an underscore gap or a dotted zero and things like that? And then you have a number of styles and a number of characters, so that somebody could at least steer themselves in a direction to say, oh, I would like something that potentially is going to support the different languages.
Exactly.
And all the different characters that they might be needing.
Yeah, and you were just mentioning styles. Maybe to quickly jump on this with...
Yeah.
I was looking at the regular style of the fonts in the tutorial because fonts often come in families. So that means you have different style, which means in the most basic way, you usually have a regular style, a bold style, an italic style, and a bold italic style. Bold makes the font a little bit fatter. Italic skews it a little bit. And some families go really wide in the spectrum of
intense,
very thin to very bold to expanded and so on. So there might be a font there where you like the characteristics of it, but it's a little bit too big for your taste. So there might be a style, if the family has more styles, that is a bit thinner and that you like a bit more. So that's basically something which I decided to not add to the tutorial too much, because I mean it's kind of like makes everything exponentially bigger if you would have to show every font in every style and so on. So that's why the PDF might be handy if you're if you want to see how many styles there is for a font.
Yeah, I thought we could just talk about briefly, like a spoiler alert. What's your favorite font? I guess I could go with mine right now. I use a program called Drafts to do all my note taking. I think it's available across kind of the whole Apple spectrum, but I like it because it does a synchronization of all my notes across it. But I wasn't very happy with the default font because it had some of the things that we were talking about, and a lot of the stuff I'm dealing with is code. And so I need this ability to kind of switch back and forth between Monospace and what I would consider my normal like note-taking font. So I recently selected Avenir Next. This is for my writing, which I think is a nice kind of pretty sans serif font, and it does pretty well for that. And then it had a very minimal set of Monospace fonts that I could pick. So I picked one called PT Mono that does a pretty good job. It's rather courier-esque in its shape and design, so it looks very typewritten, which I'm okay with, and it definitely has a lot of things that we talked about, the space between the underscores and things like that. What are you currently using as your fonts?
So there are multiple ones, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm like what we were talking at the beginning, that I'm not programming. I'm just like switching my fonts in my editor. But there are a few which. So okay, a cool thing that you can do in VS Code. I don't know if you can do it in other editors as well. You can say that for different programming languages, you use different fonts. So, for example, if you're writing a Markdown document, you can use a different font than when you're writing Python or HTML, CSS, and so on.
Yeah.
So what I did there was being true to me writing a tutorial about programming fonts to actually switch the settings. So I have different fonts that I'm using right now. And one that I got into more while writing is called Josefka Term. And the cool thing about this one is that it's one of those fonts where you can have so many configurations.
Okay.
So if you don't like a specific design of a character, you can run a script and switch it. So it's really interesting to look into it. And the other thing, which is a bit more personal to me, so there is a font named Sudo. And while I was writing the tutorial, I stumbled upon this font, and I actually realized that this font is from a former coworker of mine when I did my first internship in Berlin at Font Shop.
Nice.
From Jens Kutilek, who kind of was one of the programmers that I learned Python from, and so he at some point decided to create a programming font. So that's something which was nice to discover, because I haven't seen him for a while, and to see that he's still active in this area and has a programming font as well. So I'm using the Sudo font now as well. But yeah, apart from this, I like the JetBrains font that comes with the JetBrains editors. One that I also really like, which I already mentioned, is Mononoke, partly because of the name, but it has really nice quirky features that I really appreciate.
So I like to ask everybody who comes on the show some weekly questions, and you're probably familiar with them. The first one is, what's something that you're excited about in the world of Python right now?
So yeah, one thing that I'm super excited right now is, and I'm so late to the party, is the Haiti programming language. And I was looking it up on Real Python before our call, because I was curious if it was mentioned here before. And I think 2 years ago, David Amos was mentioning the Hedi programming language on the podcast. And I just stumbled over a YouTube video the other day. And Hedi is a programming language that's related to Python. So it's based on Python.
Okay.
But the idea is to use it as a language to teach kids programming. Felina Hermans, who created the programming language in 2020, had really genius thoughts about this topic, meaning that it's basically you put so much overhead to learning programming if you're teaching syntax and concepts at the same time, and like you have to put quotes around a string, but then you have like to put parentheses around it. So the Hedi language is, I think it's called gradual programming language. So it starts basically very similar to the written language. So it started with English. So for example, instead of for I in rage parentheses 5 parentheses, you write repeat 5 times if you want to say something like that. And so the programming language has levels, and in the end it's basically like Python, but it starts very, very low in the overhead. It has, I think, 18 levels. And the other cool thing is it's multilingual. That means it's not only English. So we were talking about German comments. And so it's, I don't know how many languages it supports right now, but you can write it in German or Arabic and stuff like this. And I think that is so cool. But again, like it's
nice. It's
active. So it's
how's it spelled?
It's Hedy and hedicode.com is the URL. And yeah, I think everybody who has a kid or wants to teach a class of kids around I would say around the age of 10 plus minus, it's really cool to look into, because I think it has super interesting concepts. So that really got me excited when I learned about this one.
Nice. So what's something that you want to learn next? This doesn't have to be programming. It could be whatever you're looking forward to next to learn.
So I recently got a split keyboard, and like a keyboard that's like split into halves.
Ah, okay.
So it's more ergonomic, which I thought was a bit weird, but it's so amazing to use. So it really helped my back and my wrists.
Yeah.
But I also realized that I'm not very good at touch typing, and so I'm currently learning touch typing again. And the other thing is that I want to use to keep my hands on a keyboard. So I'm trying to find ways of using the mouse as few times as possible, meaning learning shortcuts, using different tools for it. And so that's something which I'm nerding around a little bit recently.
Are you using any tools to help you practice that and get better at it?
So you mean touch typing or using the mouse less, or both?
Yeah, I think of like a typing tutor kinds of things. In fact, I've heard of ones that add all the interesting programming characters in also as a typing tutor. So you're not just typing prose, that you're typing actual funky characters and stuff like that. So you kind of stretch your fingers out in ways to get that under your hands without having to look for where are the curlies at again.
That is very true. So yeah, the two pages I'm using one is keybr.com, I think.
Okay.
And the other one is monkeytype.com, which are fun to use. So it's something that I'm trying out a little bit. A tool that helps me using the mouse less is called Home Row. I'm not sure if it's only for the Mac. I think so. But it basically lets you select different UI elements on the screen with a character shortcut, which also really helps a lot of clicking things. So that's something which I do in my free time right now.
Cool. I usually ask where people can follow your work online. Obviously, they can follow your work online at Real Python. Are you doing any other social media kinds of things, or are you active in that way that you would shout out ways to people can follow you?
No, I think Real Python is a good place to start. And apart from this, I'm only on LinkedIn. So anybody who wants can reach out to me on LinkedIn or at realpython.com. But yeah, any other social media channels, maybe chess.com is another one that I mentioned here and there, but I haven't been on it for a while as well.
Okay.
But yeah, the rest is more, it's too much going on that I stay out of it best I can.
I honestly say this, good for you. As somebody who spends a little too much time on it, as people who listen probably know. So
yeah, it was a journey. It was a journey though. So
yeah. That's cool. Well, Philipp, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was really fantastic to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. It's always a pleasure.
All right. I want to thank Philipp Acsany for coming on the show again this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.